So welcome everybody, and thank you for attending this presentation by the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association. My name is Greg Gillum and I am a director with the Ontario Kinesiology Association. We are particularly delighted to have Joan Weir and Shannon DeLeonardo join us today to explain more about the health benefit and insurance sector. Joan Weir is the Director of Health and Disability Policy, having 20 plus years in leadership positions at insurance companies. Joan works with all levels of government, advocating for health insurers and leading the development of health policy. And Shannon DeLeonardo is the Director of Anti-Fraud and Electronic Claims. In her role, Shannon is responsible to build consensus on concerns important to member companies and for leading industry committees, working groups, and projects related to the mitigation of benefits fraud and electronic claims management. Please help me welcome Joan and Shannon.
Thank you very much. Shannon and I'm going to start off, by the way. I'm Joan, and Shannon and I are just delighted to be here today to be able to provide you with some information that we hope can help you in your practice, and some information that might be important to you as you work with your patients. So with that, just going to go over a little bit of an agenda. So for my part, I'm going to talk about CLHIA, a little bit about the insurance industry. And I know that the development of benefit plans, how are they developed, is really kind of important to you. The types of benefit plans that are out there and how that may influence what type of insurance you see. I'm going to talk a little bit about insurance processes. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague Shannon, who will talk about benefit fraud. She'll talk about some trends that the industry is seeing, what the industry is doing as far as initiatives in this area. And then we'll leave some ample time for your questions, and we hope that you take them in the chat and send them our way. So about CLHIA, I'm not going to go over all of this, but we're typical like any industry association. We are advocacy for our members, and our members are 65 life and health insurance insurers, and that's the vast majority of insurers in Canada. We also have a track that's for eligible industry associates. And those are claims processors who aren't insurers, but who have a hand in processing claims. And I'll just mention, TELUS Health would be one, Express Scripts, and you might be familiar with those as intermediaries in the claims process. Our main office is in Toronto, but we also have one in Ottawa and one in Montreal for advocacy in those areas. I'm not going to talk a bit about mission and objectives, and won't go too far into it, but you can see that it's really to deliver maximum value for our members and our claims associates. Now I'm going to turn a little bit to some industry facts and figures. We have an active statistics area within CLHIA, and we produce annually a document called the Fact Book, which you will find on the public side of our website. And it contains all kinds of really interesting facts and figures about the insurance industry. And in fact, right now we're preparing the 2020 data that will be published later this year. And we're going to really punch out some really interesting stats that pertain to COVID and what the industry saw around COVID and mental health and disability and life deaths, life claims. There's some really interesting stuff that's obviously trends that happened in 2020. So some of the key points on this slightly busy screen, one of the key points is you look at the yellow or white box, you will see that we're talking about supplementary health insurance, and that's where you fit into insurance. So kinesiology claims would be considered supplementary health in our language. You can see that in the middle there, group plans account for 90% of the business. Only 10% is individual policies that one might purchase if one didn't have insurance, or if one was a senior and didn't have employment. So 10% are group plans. If you look at the people figure, that's an interesting stat, that 80% of working Canadians and their families are protected by private health insurance. And that's up from 76% just a decade ago. And that goes a little contrary to what we hear about, the gig economy and that sort of industry, I suppose. But what and it is a very interesting stat that 80% do. And I will say that over COVID, over 2020, of course, we were concerned about people losing their benefits, people being laid off. And there is some legislation around that I won't get into, but we regularly collected data from our members, and we still do today, to see what the impact on benefit plans has been. And we have found that only 1% of individuals have lost their benefit plans. So only 1% over COVID. On the next slide, I'd like to just break down health insurance. And again, this is where you fit in. So as you can see, 38.1 billion was paid out in health benefits. The vast majority of it does go to drugs. You can see it's 12.5 billion. Next in line at almost 9 billion is dental. Those are the two biggest. When it comes to what we call paramedical, you can see it's 4.3 billion. And I would say that that is increasing at a higher rate than any other benefit. And there are some surveys out there. I'll point you to one done by Sanofi. If you just Google Sanofi survey, very interesting. They survey plan sponsors, so owners of plans, employers, and plan members each year, and they talk about the trends that they're seeing. And one of the trends is, in fact, higher utilization of that paramedical benefit. And that would be, physio, chiro, psychology, but also kinesiology. That would be in there as well. So now I'm going to switch a little bit to benefit plans and how they are developed and who develops them. It's really interesting and key to understand why employers offer benefits. Of course, benefits are to attract and retain employees, driver of employee satisfaction. So employers put a lot of thought into how to develop their benefit plans. How much input do employees have? Of course, for some, there are collective agreements, so unions. And when unions are involved, there's typically a negotiation of lots of things, from time off to sick time to wages to benefits. And depending on the relative importance of each of those to the union, the benefit plan may not get noticed, or maybe it's the wages that don't get noticed in any particular year. And of course, really key, though, for employers is to support the employee health and reducing absence and injury and improve productivity. So employers are looking for benefits that will help keep people at work, will help keep them healthy, and will allow them to improve their productivity. There are key players, though, in this marketplace, if you want to call it that. And the employer, I'll start with the employer plan sponsor. Really, they have the decision and the criteria on cost, what the product or service is that comes onto the plan, risk tolerance, and relationships. One key thing that's important, and I think to this group, is that employers with employees in more than one province look for consistency in plan design. And that's why you might not see as much uptake on kinesiology, although it's a regulated profession in Ontario, it's not across the country. So that's one factor. And as we've already said, benefit plans are really there to attract and retain those key employees. Almost always, there's an advisor or a consultant, or we can call them a broker as well, that's in between the employer and the insurance company. So sometimes to the point where the employer maybe doesn't even meet the insurance company until a finalist presentation. So the advisor and consultant really interprets the benefits in between, interprets what the employer wants, advises the employer, works for the employer, not for the insurance company, and interprets what they want into a benefit plan. So the advisor and consultant are really important to how benefits get added to plans. Just some, consulting houses like Mercer, there's a number of them out there that are quite large that offer this type of service. And then there's the insurance company or the plan administrator. Typically own the plan risk. Now I'm going to get into a bit of that a bit later, but typically the insurance company will own the risk. Manage the employer's investment. And really when we talk about investment, we're talking about managing benefits to slow the rate of increase. And really, Shannon's going to talk a lot more about how that happens. Delivers service to the employer and plan members, and then protects benefit plans from fraudulent claims practices. So all of those have some role to play in the development of a benefits plan. I really want to drive home that coverages vary significantly. So, and again, it's the employers who decide. And of course, an insurer serving multiple employers will have multiple benefit plans that all look quite different. Indeed, an employer themselves may have different plans for different employee groups like the union group or the management group. So it's very difficult to say, this one's covered by Sun Life, so I know that this is covered, or Canada Life, so I know it's not covered. It's difficult to infer. So always, I guess the lesson to that is always make sure that the plan member themselves accesses their portal. They all have portals and understands their own plan design. Types of benefit plans. So now I'm just going to get into that. When I said that the insurer typically owns the risk, this is where I want to explain what that means. There are most of the benefit plans, about 60% of them out there in Canada, are what we call ASO, Administrative Services Only. So the employer has come to the insurance company and said, I want a benefit plan. I want all the services that you offer in terms of, keying claims and answering phones and publishing booklets, but I don't want to purchase the insurance from you. We are self-insured. And an organization that is large enough, and I say typically that's maybe 100 lives and above, can do that without being at jeopardy if they get that large drug claim or that large travel insurance claim. And so at that point in time, the employer owns the risk. So big companies like, teachers organizations, hospitals, nursing, physicians, trying to think of the large plants, Amazon, they all will own their own risk. And what that means and how that's important to you is that they are the ones that really know what benefits they want and what benefits they add on. So if you were thinking of any advocacy within the Kinesiology Association, one of the groups that you would start with are the big employers, the airlines, although maybe not right now, the other types of large employers. So insured is that business that's 100 lives and under, essentially. And those are where they do actually purchase the insurance from the insurer as well. And so if there is a risk of a big claim hitting that plan, the insurer takes that risk that happens. Traditional benefit plans are really those ones that you're all familiar with. They have the prescription drug, the dental, another separate pot for psychology, etc. And kinesiology, I think, typically might fit in with physiotherapy sometimes or with athletic therapy, from my understanding of benefit plan design. Flexible benefit plans really are where the employer has said, for my employees, I'm going to give them a range of a menu to pick from. And once a year or once every 2 years, they can change their choices. Where this really works well is if you have children and that orthodontic benefit, and they're coming up to that age where orthodontic might be involved. that's a benefit that you can add in for a few years while they're in that stage and having those braces, and then take off when they're out of that stage. So it's really a nice benefit, the flexible benefit plans. Healthcare spending accounts are almost exactly what they sound like. It's a pot of money that the employer gives to each employee to spend on health services. So it's another potential pot of money where your claims may be paid out of. And typically employers do sort of tie the definition of what's in the health or what's eligible to be paid out of the healthcare spending account to the Canada Revenue Agency's medical expense tax credits. So if you go online and see what's eligible there, you'll know what's eligible in the healthcare spending account. And then I'll just close on this slide with voluntary benefits, which are a new thing to Canada, and it really is the employer organizing benefits, but the employee pays for them. So it might be additional benefits. I think that's enough of that. And now I'm just going to look at a few quick insurance processes just to define them for you. Assignment of benefits is one that you're probably aware of, and that's where the payment is made to the healthcare provider. The patient themselves, your patient, would be responsible for their co-payment or anything above the maximum. And they are typically submitted electronically through portals, and I've just broken down the types of claims that come through electronically. Referrals or authorizations. This is misunderstood in insurance, and a lot of plan members think they need an authorization or a referral to go to any particular type of provider, or to get, go to a nurse practitioner. And really, that's not the case anymore. Most standard plans don't require those referrals, although in plan members' minds, that requirement is still there. And really, when it does exist, and it does exist in some older programs, older plan designs, it really is to determine medical necessity. That's the reason for a referral. Lots on this page. I'm not going to go through it, but I do want you to know that we do have an industry document, and if you get these slides, that I think is hyperlinked, the industry document on receipts best practices. And so what we've come up with are what we as an industry would like to see on a receipt, what can be billed under your name, and then, I think the bottom point is probably the most important to you. That the receipt should not be provided until the item is paid in full and dispensed. If you're doing treatments, that's one thing, but if you're providing some other type of item, it must be paid in full and dispensed. And then I think this is my last slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. And coordination of benefits is really where an insurer pays first, and then a second insurer comes in and pays sometimes the balance and sometimes lesser than the balance, typically the full balance. So I would just say that coordination of benefits, if you ever get any questions about it, we do also have a guideline on coordination of benefits, which is at our website. It's become more complicated with plan members having multiple plans. So we now see it common for somebody to retire. So maybe they've got some retirement benefits, but now they go back to work part-time. They've got a benefit plan there. Maybe they're still eligible under a spouse. So it does become complicated, and especially with blended families. And so you have a hyperlink there to the benefits guideline, and it's interesting reading, I would say that. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. I'm going to turn my mic off, and Shannon, over to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Anyone who knows me knows I'll never turn down an opportunity to talk about our fraud initiatives. So as you heard, I am the Director of Anti-Fraud and Electronic Claims with the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association. So I'm just going to jump right in. So fraud seen in the news. No, back one, Joan. Fraud seen in the news almost daily. And we're seeing more more and more unique ways of committing fraud, especially with this current economic environment. So whether it's e-transfers that are being intercepted, fraudulent WSIB claims, such as the case with SaskTel, who's actually seeking legal action against a former employee to recoup almost $47,000 in alleged fraudulent WCB claims. The employee was receiving full benefits through WCB and was also working part-time for another employer. Phone scams are rampant. A Quebec man's believed to have headed a network of fraudsters that would place phone calls to victims in the United States and advise them that they'd won a lottery. In Canada, however, before claiming their winnings, they needed to first submit, transfer taxes and that type of thing. So according to court documents, this man allegedly defrauded 37 victims, all of them over the age of 55, between 2015 and 2020, totaling about $1.5 million. Honestly, the list could go on. And with our current COVID environment, there's been so many related scams. I just wanted to quickly highlight a couple of points that were put out by the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre. So between March 6th, 2020 and January 31st of 2021, 11,502 Canadians lodged complaints around fraud. There were actually 9,797 victims of fraud, and they lost approximately $7 million to fraud. I did this same update in July of last year, and is so concerning because at that point in time, from March to July, there was 2,770 reports and 1,729 victims. So this increasing trend is considerably concerning. And I think the other thing that's important to note is that this is just people that are actually reporting fraud. There's so many more that are probably being impacted, but due to embarrassment, they don't report. So we all know that fraud's not restricted to those examples that I've just shared. And unfortunately, and not surprising, benefit fraud is not exempt. Benefit plans are not exempt from the risk of fraud and abuse. One thing that is consistent, that no matter the sector, when fraud occurs, it has far-reaching implications. So throughout my presentation today, I'm going to share some thoughts on the impact fraud and abuse has on benefit plans, some of the trends we're seeing, and what the CLHIA is doing in partnership with our members to fight fraud, and how we can all be a part of the solution in preventing benefit fraud. I hope at the end of this session that you're going to take away a greater understanding of what fraud is, how to protect yourselves, the impact it can have on the sustainability of benefit plans, and what the industry is focusing on. But if you leave with nothing else, I hope you leave with the understanding that this is a serious issue, and as an industry, we're all about fighting fraud. So when Joan was doing her presentation, you heard some stats that we publish as the industry. And, I know also that every audience has folks who like to see the numbers. So thinking about that slide that Joan just shared around the amounts paid out in claims, the one area I had also like to point out is the paramedical. And in 2019, as Joan showed us, the industry paid out claims totaling $4.3 billion. And that's up, as Joan mentioned, it's climbing. So in 2018, it was just under $4 billion. So, we've seen a steady rise in terms of dollars. And while it's not as high in terms of dollars as drug and dental, the survey that Joan was referencing, the Sanofi survey, shows that it is second in terms of number of claims that are submitted. So while drug and dental are 1 and 2 in terms of dollars, paramedical is number 2 in terms of number of claims submitted. and perhaps not surprising, massage therapy has historically seen the sharpest growth. And in part, this can be contributed to our Gen Y folks and the shift to prevention, as opposed to just from cure to prevention and overall wellness. And as Joan had mentioned, historically, plans did require a doctor's note for massage therapy, and that's no longer the case for most plans. It's less common. So it will be interesting following this year of COVID to see if those trends change or what we see that's different. Also, in relation to that survey that Joan was mentioning, the increase in paramedical services is being shown as a concern by about 30% of our plan sponsors. And what Sanofi did was actually ask a question: could the relatively high frequency rate of claims suggest inappropriate or potentially fraudulent use of benefits? And the results from the survey showed that 51% of plan sponsors are concerned that the misuse or overuse of paramedical plans. And the number kind of swings depending on the size of the employer, and 67% amongst large employers, or the location of the employer. So 63% in employers from Quebec. So enough on stats. I'm done. My head's spinning. So Joan, if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to kind of explain the difference between fraud and abuse, because you heard me talk about both, and both are very important when looking at the sustainability of benefit fraud or benefit plans. So fraud is essentially when someone intentionally provides false or misleading information for the purposes of financial gain. So an example of this would be a plan member or a provider claiming for services or products that were never provided or received. Abuse of the plan, also a significant concern to plan sponsors, is when someone's exploiting their plan. So an example could be plan members or their dependents using all of their annual maximums in their policy every year, even if the products or services provided may not be medically necessary. So unfortunately, some employees don't see this as being wrong, because in some cases they're paying part of the premium for their plan, so they may have a sense of entitlement. They may feel that their employer is offering it to them, so they really should use it or lose it because it's there for them. What they fail to understand is what the consequences to their benefit plan could be, and the fact that it could impact themselves as well as their coworkers through loss of jobs, increase for premiums for both themselves and coworkers. So when we think about the costs and the sustainability of plans, we want to be looking at both fraud and abuse. If I get the next slide. So what exactly does fraud look like? So, just very quickly allowing a patient to use someone else's health or dental benefits because they've exceeded their own coverage, increasing the amount on a claim to cover portions not covered by their insurance plan, claiming for a product or service under a dependence plan, claiming for a different service than what they actually receive. So they've maxed out their massage, so now they're going to bill it under physio and still be getting massage. So it can take a number of different forms, but I guess from a provider community, one thing that you want to make sure of is if you've left a clinic, make sure that they stop billing under your registration number, because that sometimes happens as well. So claims are still going in under you, and you no longer even work for that company. Next slide. One of the questions we hear often is what is the cost of benefit fraud? And, unfortunately, we don't have a good answer for that. We don't have a solid answer for that. And the reason is fraud's inherently designed to go undetected. So the full scale is actually unknown at this point in time. our members and the fraud fighting community can really only guess at the extent of the crime and the dollars lost to it. But the one thing that I think is important to note, regardless of what the actual dollar figure is, as Joan noted on her slide, as an industry we paid out $38 billion in claims in 2019. So even if we're just looking at 1% of claims that are fraudulent, that's a crazy high number. Again, I want to highlight that the potential impacts of benefit fraud are also costly. So it results in higher costs for everyone, could impact the sustainability of plans, or necessitate the need for plan design changes. Next slide, please. So trends, if you go back several years, fraud kind of looked like someone changing the amount on a claim form. And so folks would look for different handwriting or different color of ink as a potential alert for fraud. And while I'm sure some of this still occurs, fraud schemes have become far more sophisticated with today's technologies and through organized groups or organized crimes. So it's really taken on a different look and feel, and it can occur at all levels. So meaning the plan member, several plan members working together, or plan members working with the provider. And you know, it's not, as I noted at the start, we see it everywhere. So it's not restricted to just one industry. There's a lot of money at stake. So if a fraudster gets shut down in one area, they're just going to pop up somewhere else. So it's a constant battle to try and stay ahead of the curve. So let's think about a couple of examples of newer trends that we're seeing. So one of them being identity theft. So for example, you know, this is particularly risky for new grads. They see a posting on Kijiji for a job. They apply for it. Through the process of applying, the job poster wants all their personal information, their registration number, their license number. And at the end of the day, that job doesn't even exist. But now the person who posted that position has everything they need to start billing under that job applicant's ID. The other thing that we want to consider is the fact that now a lot of clinics are multidisciplinary. So you have one person sitting at the desk and they're taking the claims, processing the claims and payments for a variety of different types of providers that all work within a wellness clinic. And sometimes, you know, it's them that's actually perpetrating the fraud. They're being patient-centric perhaps and billing for a service different than what they receive because they've maxed out their benefits. But that's why, you know, as a provider, you really want to be aware of what's being billed under your number and making sure that the products and services that are being billed are actually what you provided. Another common trend seen by our members is collusion, and that's collusion between the provider and the plan member. So perhaps they're not getting any services, but they're just making a claim, and then they're splitting the funds equally between the provider and the plan member. There could be cross-industry schemes. They could be submitting claims for, you know, orthotic shoes, but then actually taking the reimbursement and purchasing shoes or designer purses. So, you know, there's a lot of different types going on when it's a collusion with the plan member and the provider. And unfortunately, these are also one of the hardest ones to detect because the two of them are working together. And so they'll be working to protect one another. And I think it's really important to remember and recognize that really only a small percentage of plan members or providers are committing fraud. Most of them are behaving appropriately. The issue is that the impact it has is significant. And that is one of the reasons as an industry, we're really taking our fraud strategy very seriously. Maybe we'll slip to the next slide now. I'm cognizant of our time. So while each of our member companies have invested significantly in people and resources to combat benefit fraud, in 2017, 2018, the CLHIA was asked to pull together a strategy for the industry. And to pull together a strategy where we would see the industry working together to combat benefit fraud. So we took a two-pronged approach: industry tools and an education awareness campaign. On the education side, we worked with an outside firm, Environics Research Analytics and Proof, to create a customer-focused education campaign. And the goal of that campaign was to educate Canadian consumers about the seriousness and the personal consequences of committing health and dental benefit fraud. So the Fraud Equals Fraud campaign program was created to educate Canadian consumers, educate them about benefit fraud so they can stop it, so that they can use their benefits appropriately. So to recognize, refuse, and report benefit fraud. Maybe we can move to the next slide, please, Joan. So, yeah, okay, next slide. One more, thank you. So we've done this. We realized as an industry, this could not be a one and done. So we've taken a multi-year approach to our education campaign. So in the first year, we did some research with Environics to get a baseline understanding. Consumers understood benefit fraud was, what their propensity was to become involved in it. We developed some creative, and you can see the banner behind me as part of that creative. We focus tested the creative, and what we heard from the focus group was, if you want this to resonate with Canadians, it needed to be direct and hard-hitting, the messaging. And that's why our messaging is fraud, real crime, real consequences. And that's why we have the imagery of a person in an orange jumpsuit with handcuffs. We developed a website to educate Canadian consumers. We created a video, and the video shows an employee being walked out of the workplace. So there's scripting on there that talks about, someone who has spent time and money to build their career, establish themselves, get a good reputation, and then by committing benefit fraud, they're throwing it all away. And you see them being walked out of the office and escorted onto an elevator by security. And it's interesting because the elevator doors actually slam, and that's to simulate jail cell doors as opposed to the actual elevator door. In the first year, we were on Facebook, YouTube, Google search, we had media coverage. So we really covered all the bases in terms of trying to get the word out about benefit fraud. Joe, maybe we can just switch to the next slide. I think I have a bit more about the actual website itself, and I would encourage you to check it out. It talks about what benefit fraud is, so the definitions that we kind of just walked through, the consequences of benefit fraud, what are the most common types of benefit fraud. They're in a bad financial situation, there's a need for money, it's seen as a victimless, a no-harm victimless crime. They're encouraged to get involved by others that they trust. Again, we talk about the most common types of fraud that we just went through some of those. And I think that one thing that we found during the research phase is that 75% of Canadians that were surveyed incorrectly believe that the main punishment for committing benefit fraud was having to pay higher premiums or being forced to reimburse their claim payments. So being able to educate them that they could lose their job, that they could end up with a criminal record, was really important. And on our website, you'll see that there's an FAQ section. So frequently asked questions that people may have around benefit fraud, but there's also a quiz. And the quiz section of this website pulled questions from the baseline understanding survey that we did before we started. And we were able to use results from the baseline survey, the quiz questions, and the most often visited FAQs to help us inform campaigns going forward. So our actual campaign runs only 8 weeks each year. And while we are currently in Fraud Prevention Month, we don't run our campaign during Fraud Prevention Month. We actually run it in October, November. And the reason being, we see a lot of communication out there encouraging people to use or lose their benefits. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, abuse of benefit plans is also a concern. So using up your benefits, whether or not you need them, is something that we really wanted to get ahead of. So, did we see positive results from our first campaign? Absolutely, we did. Not only did we see that we were, getting a lot of traction in terms of people viewing our website, but we also, attracted the attention of media. So, CBC picked up a story and did a broadcast in 2018 on benefit fraud. So really working to get the word out. If we can go to the next slide, Joan, please. So after the first year, it was, let's keep moving. And so in 2019, the term go big or go home, we went big. So we had billboards, transit shelter ads, all looking at educating consumers about benefit fraud and encouraging them to learn more. And one thing we really wanted to understand is whether or not our campaign was having any impact. So in 2019, we did some additional research following that campaign just to see whether or not people remembered seeing it, whether it was having the type of impact we wanted, which was educating consumers and eventually working to change behavior. And I think that we can say it absolutely did. And I wanted to, sorry, next slide, Joan, sorry. The other thing when I was talking about going big or going home that we did in 2019 was what are called programmatic direct deals. So, when you're watching something on YouTube, you want to check out a sports event or a news feature, and you have to watch a video first. We were actually on there as well. So some great uptake and learnings from that. And the one thing that we found in our, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in our 2020 campaign, while people were at home, we did another ad like this on YouTube. But because people were at home, they were actually watching YouTube on their home TVs as opposed to on their mobile devices. So they were watching our 30 and 15-second videos on the big screen. So it was almost like having a commercial. So that was great. So I think that from our research following our 2019 campaign, what we saw was that 1 in 4 people who saw our material actually recalled seeing the ads, seeing the billboards. And so, from a marketing standpoint, that's strong recall. And the other thing that we saw was, when we did our pre-research, people didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to report benefit fraud. They didn't want to, they didn't know where to. And what we saw following the research in 2019 was that not only were people more apt to report, 34% of people who were surveyed were not only going to report it, but they'd report it to law enforcement. So, really some great learning and behavior change that we saw in that. If we go to the next slide. In 2020, We wanted to continue our efforts around educating consumers, but right from the start, there was a realization that we needed to also include a section of our campaign to educate healthcare providers. So in 2020, we actually added another page to our website, and it has a bit of a different tone and some different information because it's directed at providers. So as opposed to real crime, real consequences, our messaging on that page is really around protect your practice and protect your patients. So information on how to protect your practice and protect your patients, how to work better with the industry. You know, we have also on this page FAQs and a quiz. So our FAQs and our quiz focus on things like, are only providers who are suspected of fraud going to be audited? False, not true. Audits are a part of our members' business. It's a requirement from the plan sponsors. So it's not indicative that you're guilty of fraud that an insurer is asking to do an audit. It talks about incentives and, you know, what are incentives and should you offer incentives? And so again, no, you know, incentives are not something that are supported by the industry. They increase utilization on plans for what would be deemed potentially non-medically necessary treatments or services. So we cover that off. And we really just kind of, those are our quick hits in terms of what's on the page, but we know we want to continue to develop those the messaging and get it out to more people. So we have begun to work on industry one-pagers. So information sheets that will be available to colleges, associations, providers around how to work with the industry. So a little bit more detail around what Joan had covered around the insurance landscape, understanding who the key players are, what the responsibilities are, one on protecting your practice, and one on incentives specifically. So now, next slide, please. We're in 2021, and let's do one more slide. Sorry, didn't know that. In 2021, we're going to continue to educate consumers. As I mentioned, we're going to expand on what we're doing for providers. And in fact, along with the industry one-pagers, we're working on a series of videos, educational videos, that will be content that mirrors those industry one-pagers with quizzes and the like. So work is still going on, and look for that, the videos not to be launched in October of 2021. If we go to our next slide, I know I'm out of time, so I just really want to say, you know, if you think using health and dental benefits dishonestly is no big deal, think again. So whether it's just one small time thing or a larger ongoing scheme, benefit fraud of any kind is still considered a fraud, and it is a real crime with real consequences. Next slide, Joan, please. I think that's, and as I mentioned at the start, actually, what I mentioned earlier was that we were taking a two-pronged approach. So this was the education campaign that I was able to focus on today. We're also looking at what kind of tools we could be rolling out that the industry could leverage. We're not there yet, but that could be a future presentation. So again, I hope you do understand that the life and health insurance industry is taking fraud and abuse very seriously. And as reflected in our multi-year campaign, we understand it's not one and done. We all need to work together to stay ahead of benefit fraud.